The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Villa Rosa, casting golden rays across the marble floors and antique furniture that had witnessed countless celebrations over the centuries. In the bridal suite on the second floor, Gabriella Marino stood before an ornate mirror, her reflection showing a woman trapped between duty and desire, between obedience and rebellion. The wedding gown she wore was a masterpiece of Italian craftsmanship, ivory lace cascading down her slender frame, delicate beadwork catching the light with every shallow breath she took, and a cathedral-length train that pooled behind her like a waterfall of silk and promises. Yet despite the beauty of the dress and the significance of the day, Gabriella's dark eyes held no joy, no anticipation, only a hollow resignation that had settled into her bones over the past 6 months since her father had announced her engagement to Marco Bianchi. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached up to adjust the pearl-encrusted tiara nestled in her upswept black hair, each curl painstakingly styled to perfection by the team of professionals her father had hired for this day. Behind her, 3 bridesmaids' cousins and childhood friends fluttered about with champagne glasses and nervous laughter, their excitement a stark contrast to the growing dread that squeezed Gabriella's chest like a vice. They spoke of romance and forever, of the handsome groom waiting downstairs and the lavish reception that would follow, but their words floated past Gabriella like smoke, insubstantial and impossible to grasp. She had learned long ago that her life was not her own, that her dreams of studying architecture in Florence, of traveling the world and designing buildings that touched the sky, had been nothing more than childish fantasies her father had indulged until she became useful to him in other ways. Marco Bianchi was 42 years old, successful, and charming in the calculated way of men who had learned to use their smile as a weapon. He had courted Gabriella with expensive gifts and public displays of affection, always careful to maintain the appearance of a loving suitor while his eyes remained cold and assessing whenever he thought no one was watching. Gabriella's father, Antonio Marino, had praised the match endlessly, speaking of business opportunities and strategic alliances, of how this marriage would save the restaurant empire he had built from the ground up, which had been mysteriously hemorrhaging money for the past 3 years. What Antonio never mentioned, what he carefully avoided in every conversation about the wedding, was that Gabriella had no choice in the matter, that her consent had been assumed rather than requested, and that her happiness was merely a pleasant bonus rather than a requirement. The sound of string music drifted up from the garden where 200 guests had gathered under white tents adorned with thousands of roses. Gabriella could hear the murmur of conversation, the clink of glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from people celebrating a union they believed to be built on love. Her stomach churned with nausea, and she pressed a hand against the intricate beadwork of her bodice, feeling her heart hammer against her ribcage like a trapped bird desperate for escape. One of her bridesmaids, Sophia, noticed her pallor and rushed over with concern etched across her face, asking if Gabriella needed water or perhaps a moment to sit down, but Gabriella shook her head and forced her lips into a smile that felt like broken glass. The wedding coordinator, a stern woman named Signora Benedetti who had orchestrated dozens of high society weddings with military precision, swept into the room with her clipboard and headset, announcing that it was time to begin the processional. The bridesmaids squealed with excitement and hurried to arrange themselves in order, checking their matching lavender dresses and clutching their bouquets of white peonies and eucalyptus. Gabriella's father appeared in the doorway, resplendent in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his silver hair perfectly groomed and his face beaming with pride and relief. He crossed the room to his daughter, his eyes growing misty as he took in the sight of her in her bridal finery, and he spoke words about how beautiful she looked, how proud her mother would have been if she had lived to see this day, how this marriage would secure their family's future for generations to come. But Gabriella barely heard him. She was too focused on the desperate voice in her head that screamed for her to run, to tear off the suffocating dress and flee through the gardens and into the hills beyond, to disappear into a life where her father's debts and Marco's calculating coldness couldn't reach her. Yet even as these thoughts raced through her mind, her body moved mechanically, accepting her father's arm and allowing herself to be led toward the door. The bridesmaids had already begun their descent down the grand staircase, their laughter echoing through the villa's elegant halls, and soon it would be Gabriella's turn to walk toward a future she didn't want with a man she didn't love. That's when the first gunshot shattered the afternoon stillness. The sound was deafening, a crack that seemed to split the world in two, followed immediately by screams from the garden and the crash of breaking glass. Gabriella's father froze, his grip on her arm tightening painfully as confusion and fear flooded his features. Signora Benedetti's voice squawked through the headset, urgent and panicked, reporting chaos downstairs, people running, someone shouting about armed men. More gunshots followed, though Gabriella would later learn they were blanks designed to terrorize rather than kill. And the villa erupted into pandemonium as guests stampeded toward exits and security personnel shouted contradictory orders. Before Gabriella could process what was happening, the bridal suite door exploded inward, the antique wood splintering under the force of a heavy boot. 5 men in black tactical gear and masks poured into the room, their presence so sudden and overwhelming that for a moment everyone simply stood frozen in shocked silence. The bridesmaids screamed, dropping their bouquets and scrambling backward toward the windows, while Antonio Marino attempted to place himself between his daughter and the intruders, his voice rising in indignant outrage as he demanded to know who they were and what they wanted. The leader of the masked men was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the dangerous grace of a predator utterly confident in his power. His eyes, visible through the slits in his black mask, were a startling shade of grey, cold and intense as they swept the room before fixing on Gabriella with unnerving focus. He ignored Antonio's shouted questions and strode directly toward her, his heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor with purposeful intent. Gabriella's instinct was to run, but her elaborate dress and heeled shoes made that impossible, and before she could even attempt to flee, the man had reached her. In one fluid motion, he bent and lifted Gabriella over his shoulder as if she weighed nothing, one arm clamping around the back of her thighs to secure her while his other hand maintained a grip on his weapon. The indignity and terror of the position snapped Gabriella out of her shock, and she immediately began to fight, pounding her fists against his back, kicking her legs as much as the restrictive gown allowed, and screaming at the top of her lungs for him to release her. Her father lunged forward, attempting to pull her away, but one of the other masked men intercepted him, pressing a gun to his chest and forcing him back against the wall. Antonio's face had gone pale, and Gabriella saw something flicker in his eyes that looked disturbingly like recognition rather than confusion. As the masked man carried her toward the door, Gabriella continued her struggles, her tiara falling from her hair and clattering to the floor, hairpins scattering as her carefully styled curls came loose around her shoulders. The man's grip never wavered, and through the chaos and her own panicked breathing, she heard him speak for the first time, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her body where it pressed against his shoulder. The words were in Italian, accented with the particular cadence of northern regions, and they sent ice through her veins despite their almost conversational tone. "Your father made a deal with the wrong family, Principessa," he said, and there was something in the way he used the endearment princess that made it sound like both an observation and a threat. Gabriella tried to respond, to demand answers or plead for release, but her position made it difficult to breathe properly, and her words came out as gasps and fragments. The masked men moved as a unit through the villa, their coordination speaking of military training and extensive planning. They encountered no real resistant security guards who attempted to intervene, were quickly subdued with brutal efficiency, and guests who got too close were warned away with the barrels of automatic weapons. The bridesmaids' screams followed them down the staircase, mixing with the general chaos of the disrupted wedding, and Gabriella caught glimpses of overturned chairs, trampled flower arrangements, and terrified faces as she was carried through what should have been her wedding venue. The late afternoon sun blinded her momentarily as they emerged into the villa's courtyard, where 3 black SUVs with tinted windows idled with doors already open. The masked man carrying Gabriella moved straight to the middle vehicle and deposited her onto the leather back seat with surprising care, considering the violence of the abduction. Before she could scramble for the opposite door, he had climbed in beside her, and 2 of his men filled the front seats. The door slammed shut with a heavy thunk that sounded horribly final, and the vehicle was moving before Gabriella could even process an escape plan. She threw herself at the door handle, yanking desperately, but the child's safety locks were engaged and the window controls had been disabled from the front. The man beside her made no move to restrain her further, simply watching as she exhausted herself trying to find a way out of the moving vehicle, his grey eyes visible through the mask assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Finally, breathless and with tears of frustration streaming down her face, Gabriella turned to face him, her wedding dress bunched awkwardly around her legs and her hair a wild tangle around her shoulders. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking but defiant. "What do you want with me?" The man tilted his head slightly, and she sensed rather than saw the hint of a smile beneath the mask. "All in good time, Principessa. For now, I suggest you save your energy. We have a long drive ahead." Gabriella wanted to launch herself at him, to claw at the mask and force him to answer her questions, but something in his posture warned her that such an attempt would be easily deflected and possibly humiliating. Instead, she pressed herself as far from him as the confines of the vehicle allowed, her mind racing through possibilities and explanations. Her father's words from recent months echoed in her memory, mentions of financial difficulties, terse phone conversations conducted behind closed doors, the tension that had lined his face whenever business was discussed. She had assumed it was simply the normal stress of running a large restaurant empire, but now darker possibilities crowded her thoughts. The convoy of SUVs left Villa Rosa behind, speeding along winding country roads that climbed into the mountains beyond the city. Gabriella watched through tinted windows as the landscape changed from manicured gardens and suburban sprawl to wild forests and rocky hillsides dotted with ancient olive groves. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. She tried to memorize the route, noting landmarks and turns, though she wasn't sure what good such information would do her in her current situation. An hour passed in tense silence, broken only by occasional radio communications in the front seat, brief exchanges in coded language that Gabriella couldn't decipher. Her captor remained still beside her, his presence simultaneously threatening and oddly... But there was something in the way he had positioned himself that suggested he was more guardian than active threat at this moment. It confused her, this contradiction and confusion mixed with her fear and anger to create a volatile emotional cocktail that made it difficult to think clearly. Finally, as twilight deepened into true evening, the vehicles turned off the main road onto a private drive marked only by a discreet iron gate that swung open at their approach. The drive wound through more forest before emerging into a clearing where an enormous estate sprawled across the hillside like something from a Renaissance painting. The main house was a 3-story villa of honey-colored stone with terracotta roof tiles and tall windows that glowed with warm light. Manicured gardens surrounded the structure, and Gabriella could see the dark shapes of additional buildings, guest houses, perhaps, or staff quarters scattered throughout the extensive grounds. The SUVs pulled up to the main entrance, where marble steps led to massive wooden doors carved with intricate designs. The man beside Gabriella finally moved, reaching up to remove his mask in one smooth motion, and for the first time, she saw the face of her captor. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with features that belonged in classical sculptures. Strong jaw darkened with a day's worth of stubble, straight nose that had been broken at least once judging by a slight crook near the bridge, and those penetrating grey eyes that had watched her throughout the drive. His hair was dark and slightly disheveled from the mask, and there was a thin scar running through his left eyebrow that suggested a violent past. He was, Gabriella realized with a jolt that felt almost like betrayal, devastatingly handsome in the dangerous way of men who knew exactly what they were capable of. "Welcome to your new home, Gabriella Marino," he said, his voice without the muffling effect of the mask, now rich and cultured, the Italian of someone well-educated, despite the violence he had just orchestrated. "I am Rocco DeLuca, and you are going to be my guest for the foreseeable future." The name struck her like a physical blow. DeLuca. Everyone in Italy knew that name, whispered in back rooms and avoided in polite conversation. The DeLuca family controlled territory spanning from Milan to Naples, their influence reaching into politics, business, and every shadow where power exchanged hands. They were old money and older violence, a dynasty built on blood and maintained through fear and respect in equal measure. And this man, this Rocco DeLuca, was reportedly the heir to that dark empire, groomed from birth to take over when his aging father finally stepped aside. Gabriella's throat went dry as the full implications crashed over her. This wasn't a random kidnapping or a case of mistaken identity. This was calculated, purposeful, and connected somehow to her father and the wedding that had been so violently interrupted. Before she could formulate a response, Rocco opened his door and stepped out, then offered his hand to help her exit the vehicle. It was such a civilized gesture, so utterly at odds with the fact that he had just abducted her at gunpoint, that Gabriella could only stare at his outstretched hand in disbelief. When she didn't immediately take it, Rocco's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement. "You can accept my assistance, or I can carry you again. Your choice, Principessa." Pride and practicality warred within Gabriella before she reluctantly placed her hand in his, allowing him to help her from the vehicle. Her wedding dress had not been designed for kidnapping, and she had to gather the voluminous skirts in her free hand to avoid tripping as she climbed the marble steps. Rocco's grip remained steady but not painful, his hand warm and calloused in a way that spoke of physical training rather than the soft hands of men who pushed papers for a living. The interior of the villa was as impressive as the exterior, all polished marble and soaring ceilings with elaborate frescoes depicting mythological scenes. Fresh flowers in enormous vases perfumed the air, and artwork that Gabriella suspected was original rather than reproduction lined the walls. Rocco led her through a grand foyer, past a sweeping staircase, and down a hallway to what appeared to be his private study. The room was masculine and refined floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, a massive desk of dark wood, leather furniture arranged around a fireplace where flames crackled invitingly, and paintings that featured landscapes and abstract pieces rather than the classical art displayed elsewhere in the house. Rocco released her hand once they were inside and moved to a sideboard where crystal decanters held various amber liquids. He poured himself 2 fingers of what looked like whiskey, then glanced back at Gabriella with a raised eyebrow in silent question. She shook her head mutely, still trying to process the surreal nature of her situation standing in a Mafia don's study in her wedding dress, hours after being kidnapped from her own ceremony, facing a man who held her life in his hands with the casual ease of someone accustomed to absolute power. "Sit," Rocco said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs, but Gabriella remained standing, her spine straight and her chin lifted in defiance despite the fear that still coursed through her veins. "I prefer to stand," she said, and was grateful her voice came out steady. "And I prefer explanations. Why am I here? What do you want from me?" Rocco studied her for a long moment, taking a slow sip of his whiskey, and something that might have been respect flickered across his features. "Your father, Antonio Marino, didn't just owe my family money," he began, his tone conversational as if they were discussing the weather rather than her abduction. "He stole from us, 5 million euros, to be precise, which he diverted from accounts he was supposed to be managing on our behalf for his legitimate restaurant operations." Gabriella felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. 5 million euros. The number was staggering, incomprehensible. Her father had always been careful with money, sometimes painfully so, lecturing her about responsibility and the value of a euro earned through honest work. The idea that he would steal such an enormous sum, especially from the DeLuca family, seemed impossible. "You're lying," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she remembered her father's stressed conversations, his insistence on her marriage to Marco despite her protests, the way he had looked when Rocco's men had burst into the bridal suite not surprised but afraid. "I wish I were," Rocco replied, setting his glass down on the desk and leaning against it, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "But the evidence is quite clear. Your father has been skimming from us for 3 years, thinking he was clever enough to hide it in his complex business structures. He wasn't. And when we confronted him about the missing money, he tried to buy more time by arranging your marriage to Marco Bianchi." The room seemed to spin around Gabriella as another piece of the puzzle fell into place. "Marco works for you?" "No," Rocco said, and his expression darkened with something that looked like anger or perhaps disgust. "Marco works for the Bianchi family, who are rivals attempting to expand into our territory. Your father thought if he allied himself with them through your marriage, it would protect him from our retribution. He was wrong. Understanding crashed over Gabriella like a wave, leaving her gasping and struggling to maintain her composure. Her wedding had never been about love or even about saving the family business in a general sense. It had been her father's desperate attempt to escape the consequences of his own criminal stupidity by sacrificing his daughter to a rival mafia family. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have, and she felt her legs begin to tremble beneath the weight of the ruined dress. "So I'm what?" she demanded, her voice rising with emotion she could no longer contain. "Collateral? Revenge? A message to my father?" "All of the above," Rocco said bluntly, and at least he had the decency not to sugarcoat it. "You will remain here until your father pays his debt in full and provides us with detailed information about Marco Bianchi's operations. Once those conditions are met, you'll be free to go." "And if my father can't pay?" Gabriella asked, though she already knew the answer. If Antonio Marino had €5 million, he wouldn't have been stealing from the DeLuca family in the first place. Rocco's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a hardness that sent chills down her spine. "Then we'll re-evaluate the situation when that time comes." The carefully worded non-answer was more terrifying than a direct threat would have been, because it left her imagination to fill in the horrifying possibilities. Gabriella felt the last reserves of her strength crumbling, her knees buckling beneath her, and she stumbled backward until she collided with one of the leather chairs. She gripped its high back, using it to keep herself upright, and stared at this man who held her fate in his hands, this stranger named Rocco DeLuca, who had just systematically destroyed every illusion she had about her life and her father. "You can't just keep me here," she said, but it sounded weak even to her own ears. "People will look for me. The police. The police work for families like mine," Rocco interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. "Your disappearance will be investigated, certainly, but the official story will be that you ran away rather than marry Marco Bianchi, which, if you're being honest with yourself, is exactly what you wanted to do anyway." The accuracy of that statement stung because it was true. How many times over the past 6 months had she fantasized about fleeing before the wedding? But not like this. Never like this. She had imagined freedom, not another cage, however gilded. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously, refusing to cry in front of this man who had just stolen her from one bad situation and deposited her into another. "I need to speak to my father," she said, clinging to the one concrete thing she could think of. "That won't be possible," Rocco replied, finishing his whiskey and setting the glass down with a soft clink. "Not until I'm convinced it won't compromise our security. Your father knows where you are, generally speaking, and he knows what's required to get you back. The ball, as they say, is in his court." Gabriella wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of being used as a pawn in games played by men who saw her as a commodity rather than a person. But exhaustion was catching up with her, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the kidnapping and revelations finally draining away and leaving her hollow and shaking. Her elaborate wedding dress suddenly felt unbearably heavy, the beadwork digging into her skin, the corset-style bodice restricting her breathing until she felt like she might suffocate. Rocco must have noticed her distress because he straightened from the desk and moved toward a phone on a side table. He pressed a button and spoke briefly in Italian, and moments later a woman appeared in the doorway, middle-aged, kindly-faced, and dressed in simple but elegant clothing that suggested she was household staff of some importance. "This is Teresa," Rocco said, gesturing to the woman. "She manages the household and will see to your needs. She'll show you to your room and provide you with appropriate clothing. I suggest you rest, it's been a long day." The casual dismissal sparked anger through Gabriella's exhaustion, and she found herself moving across the room before conscious thought could intervene. Her hand connected with Rocco's cheek in a slap that cracked through the study like a gunshot, the sound shocking in its violence. His head barely moved from the impact, but his expression shifted into something dangerous and unreadable as he slowly turned his gaze back to her. The grey eyes had gone cold as winter steel, and Gabriella realized with a thrill of fear that she had just struck one of the most dangerous men in Italy. For several heartbeats they stood frozen in tableau, Gabriella's hand still raised, her chest heaving with emotion and exertion, Rocco's cheek bearing the red imprint of her fingers, his body coiled with tension as if deciding how to respond to this unprecedented defiance. Teresa had frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock and perhaps a hint of fear for what might happen next. Then, slowly, deliberately, Rocco reached up and rubbed his cheek, a ghost of something that might have been admiration or respect crossing his features before it was replaced by stern resolve. "You get one of those," he said quietly, his voice deadly calm. "Consider it used. The next time you raise your hand to me, Principessa, there will be consequences. I don't take orders from you." Gabriella spat, but even as she said it, she knew how foolish and hollow the words sounded given her current circumstances. "You will learn to," Rocco replied, and there was no anger in his tone, just absolute certainty. "This isn't a negotiation, and I am not your enemy despite what you currently think. You are under my protection as well as my control, which means you will be treated with respect and consideration as long as you behave with basic civility. But make no mistake, you are not in a position to make demands or issue challenges." He turned to Teresa and nodded. "Show her to the East Wing bedroom, make sure she has everything she needs, and Teresa, the windows are to remain locked, with guards posted discreetly outside." The message was clear. Gabriella would have luxury and comfort, but she would not have freedom. She was a prisoner here, no matter how beautiful the cage. Teresa moved forward, her expression sympathetic as she gently touched Gabriella's arm and murmured soothing words in Italian about hot baths and comfortable beds. Gabriella wanted to resist, to maintain her defiant stance, but her body was betraying her with trembling exhaustion and the creeping numbness of shock. As Teresa began to lead her from the study, Gabriella paused in the doorway and looked back at Rocco, who had returned to his desk and was already examining papers spread across its surface as if she had already been dismissed from his thoughts. "My father might have made mistakes," she said, her voice low but clear, "but I am not responsible for his death." Rocco looked up, his grey eyes meeting hers across the room. "You're right," he said simply, and the acknowledgement surprised her. "This situation is not fair to you, but fairness is a luxury neither of us can afford right now. Good night, Gabriella." The use of her first name without the mocking Principessa felt oddly intimate, and Gabriella found herself unable to formulate a response. She allowed Teresa to guide her out of the study, through more elegant hallways to a grand staircase that curved upward to the second floor. Her wedding dress rustled against the marble steps, a reminder of the life she had almost been forced into and the different prison she now found herself in instead. The bedroom Teresa led her to was nothing like a prison cell. It was a suite really, with a main bedroom featuring a four-poster bed draped in luxurious linens, an attached sitting room with a small library and comfortable furniture arranged around another fireplace, and a bathroom that was larger than Gabriella's entire bedroom at her father's house. Everything was decorated in soft creams and blues, with fresh flowers on the nightstand and artwork that featured peaceful landscapes. The windows were indeed locked, as Rocco had ordered, and Gabriella could see the dark shapes of guards moving in the gardens below. Teresa helped her out of the wedding dress with gentle efficiency, carefully unlacing the corset and easing the heavy gown from Gabriella's trembling body. Underneath, Gabriella wore a delicate silk slip, and she wrapped her arms around herself as Teresa hung the dress in an enormous closet that was already filled with clothing in what appeared to be exactly Gabriella's size. Someone had planned for her arrival, had anticipated her measurements and preferences, which meant this kidnapping had been orchestrated well in advance. A hot bath had been drawn while Teresa had been helping with the dress, and the older woman guided Gabriella toward the bathroom with motherly insistence. The water was perfect, scented with lavender and equipped with an array of expensive soaps and oils, and as Gabriella sank into its warmth, she felt the first crack in her composure. Tears began to fall, mixing with the bathwater, as the full weight of the day crashed over her. The wedding she hadn't wanted, the father who had betrayed her, the violent kidnapping, the dangerous man who now controlled her fate. Teresa left her to bathe in privacy, promising to return with food and tea, and alone in the elegant bathroom, Gabriella allowed herself to cry with the abandon of someone whose world had completely shattered in the space of a few hours. She cried for her lost freedom, for the dreams of architecture and travel that seemed more distant than ever, for the trust she had placed in a father who had sold her out to protect himself. She cried until she was empty, until the bathwater had begun to cool, and then she forced herself to move, to wash and to emerge from the tub and wrap herself in the plush robe that hung on the back of the door. When she returned to the bedroom, she found that Teresa had laid out a simple nightgown and left a tray with soup, bread, and herbal tea on a small table near the windows. Gabriella wasn't hungry, but she forced herself to eat a little, knowing she would need her strength for whatever came next. Through the windows, she could see the lights of the estate scattered across the grounds, and beyond them, darkness where the mountains rose against the night sky. Somewhere out there was the life she had known, imperfect and constrained as it had been, and she wondered if she would ever see it again. Sleep seemed impossible, but exhaustion eventually claimed her despite her racing thoughts. She climbed into the enormous bed, her body sinking into mattresses and pillows that felt like clouds, and stared at the ceiling where shadows from the firelight danced in hypnotic patterns. Her last conscious thought before sleep dragged her under was of grey eyes watching her with an intensity that was both threatening and oddly protective. And though she hated herself for it, some small part of her had to acknowledge that in the moment when Rocco had lifted her over his shoulder and carried her away from Villa Rosa, she had felt something she hadn't expected: relief. The first morning of captivity arrived with sunlight streaming through the locked windows of Gabriella's luxurious prison, painting golden rectangles across the plush carpet and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air with lazy indifference to her situation. She woke slowly, confused for several disorienting seconds about where she was, before memory returned in a crushing wave: the ruined wedding, the kidnapping. Rocco DeLuca's cold grey eyes as he explained that she was collateral for her father's crimes. Gabriella remained motionless in the enormous bed, staring at the canopy above her and trying to formulate some kind of plan, some path forward through this nightmare that didn't involve complete capitulation to her captor's control. A soft knock at the door preceded Teresa's entrance, the older woman carrying a tray laden with coffee, fresh bread, fruit, and pastries that filled the room with the scent of butter and sugar. She greeted Gabriella with warm Italian pleasantries, as if this were a normal guest situation rather than a kidnapping, setting the tray on the sitting room table and moving to open the curtains wider. Gabriella sat up, pulling the sheets around herself like armor, and studied Teresa's kind face for signs of whether the woman was an ally or simply another cog in Rocco's well-oiled machine. "How long have you worked for the DeLuca family?" Gabriella asked as Teresa poured coffee into delicate china cups. 23 years, Teresa replied without hesitation, her weathered hands steady as she added sugar without asking how Gabriella preferred it, somehow already knowing. "Since before Signor Rocco was born. I helped raise him and his sister after their mother passed." The mention of Rocco having a mother who had died sparked unwanted curiosity in Gabriella, a desire to understand the man who held her captive, but she pushed it aside as irrelevant. "And you're comfortable working for criminals?" The question came out sharper than intended, but Gabriella was past caring about politeness. Teresa's expression didn't change, though something flickered in her dark eyes: a sadness, perhaps, or understanding. "I work for a family," she said simply. "They have provided for me, protected me, treated me with respect for over 2 decades. What they do in their business is not my concern, just as what your father did in his restaurants was not yours. We are all simply trying to survive, Signorina." The gentle rebuke hit harder than anger would have, because it was essentially true. Gabriella had benefited from her father's wealth without questioning too deeply where it came from, had lived in luxury while remaining willfully ignorant of the deals and alliances that funded her comfortable life. She was not as innocent as she wanted to believe, and that realization sat heavy in her stomach, mixing with the anxiety and fear that had become her constant companions. Teresa left after ensuring Gabriella had everything she needed, and alone again, Gabriella forced herself to eat despite having no appetite. She needed strength, needed to keep her mind clear if she was going to find a way out of this situation. After breakfast, she explored her suite more thoroughly, searching for any weakness in the security, any possible escape route. But the windows were not only locked but reinforced with what appeared to be bulletproof glass, and the door, while not visibly barred, was clearly monitored given how quickly Teresa had appeared when she tested the handle. The closet revealed an extensive wardrobe in her exact size, everything from casual clothes to elegant evening wear, all in styles that reflected her personal taste with unsettling accuracy. Someone had studied her, observed her preferences, and replicated them here in this gilded cage. She selected the simplest outfit she could find: dark jeans, a soft cashmere sweater, and comfortable leather boots, and dressed with mechanical efficiency, refusing to acknowledge how perfectly everything fit or how expensive the fabrics felt against her skin. 2 days passed in this strange suspended reality. Gabriella was allowed to move freely within the estate under constant but discreet supervision. Guards who maintained professional distance while making it clear that any attempt to leave the grounds would be swiftly intercepted. She explored the villa with the analytical eye of someone trained to appreciate architecture, noting the Renaissance-era bones of the structure that had been updated with modern amenities while maintaining historical integrity. The library particularly drew her attention. 3 stories of floor-to-ceiling books accessed by a spiral staircase, with comfortable reading nooks and windows that overlooked the gardens where fountains sparkled in the afternoon light. It was in the library on the 3rd day that Gabriella encountered Rocco again. She had been curled in a window seat with a book on Italian Renaissance architecture, finding comfort in familiar subject matter when the sound of the heavy door opening made her look up. Rocco entered with papers in one hand and reading glasses perched on his nose, an oddly scholarly image that conflicted with her mental picture of him as pure violent criminal. He stopped when he saw her, something unreadable crossing his features before settling into cautious neutrality. "I didn't realize anyone was using the library," he said, making no move to leave despite his words suggesting he might have sought solitude. "I didn't realize I needed permission," Gabriella replied, her tone careful. She hadn't forgotten his warning about consequences for defiance, but she refused to be completely cowed. Rocco removed his reading glasses and studied her for a long moment. "You don't need permission to use any room in this house except my personal quarters and certain restricted areas. I'm not trying to make you miserable, Gabriella. Just contained." "There's a difference?" she asked, unable to keep the bitter sarcasm from her voice. Instead of anger, something that might have been amusement flickered in his grey eyes. "Fair point." He gestured to the chair across from her window seat. "May I sit, or would you prefer I leave you to your reading?" The question surprised her. He was asking permission in his own library, and Gabriella found herself curious despite her better judgment about what might happen if she allowed this conversation to continue. "It's your house," she said eventually, which wasn't exactly permission but wasn't a refusal either. Rocco settled into the leather chair with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body, setting his papers on the side table and regarding her with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. He was dressed more casually than during their first encounter: dark slacks and a white shirt with sleeves rolled to reveal muscular forearms marked with scars that suggested a history of physical conflict. Without the tactical gear and mask, he looked less like a Mafia enforcer and more like a dangerous scholar, which was somehow even more unsettling. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding toward the book in her lap. Gabriella held it up so he could see the cover. "Brunelleschi's Dome. I've read it before, but—" She trailed off, unsure how to explain that she returned to certain books the way others returned to old friends, seeking comfort in familiar ideas and beautiful descriptions of buildings that had stood for centuries. "Architecture," Rocco said, and it wasn't a question. "Teresa mentioned you studied it at university before your father pulled you back to help with family obligations." The casual mention of personal information he couldn't have known sent a chill through Gabriella. "You've been investigating me." "Of course I have," Rocco replied without apology. "I needed to know who I was taking and what resources might be deployed to retrieve you. Your interest in architecture is noted extensively in your social media profiles and university records. You were top of your class in structural design, particularly interested in how buildings can create community spaces that foster connection between people." Hearing her academic passions summarized so clinically by her captor felt like a violation, and Gabriella clutched the book more tightly. "And what else do your investigations tell you about me? What other private details have you stolen?" "That you're stronger than your father gives you credit for," Rocco said, his tone shifting into something more serious. That you've spent most of your life trying to make yourself smaller, quieter, less troublesome so as not to burden him. That you gave up your dreams because he asked you to. And you were planning to marry a man you didn't love for the same reason. That despite all of that, there's a core of defiance in you that refuses to be completely crushed, evidenced by the fact that you slapped me in my own study when most people in your position would have been too terrified to move. Gabriella felt exposed under his analytical gaze, as if he had peeled back her skin and examined the mechanisms underneath. Why does any of that matter to you? I'm just leverage. You're not just anything, Rocco said quietly, and the unexpected gentleness in his voice caught her off guard. You're a person who's been failed by someone who should have protected you. That's not your fault, Gabriella, any more than my mother's death was mine. We're both casualties of other people's choices. The mention of his mother hung in the air between them, an offering of shared pain that Gabriella wasn't sure she wanted to accept. But curiosity won out over caution. Teresa said your mother died. What happened? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, his expression closing off as if he regretted the personal revelation. Then he leaned back in the chair and stared at something beyond her shoulder, his eyes focusing on memories rather than the present. I was 12. The Rossi family rivals at the time decided to send a message to my father by targeting his wife. She was shopping in Florence with just 2 bodyguards, which apparently wasn't enough. They took her in broad daylight, and by the time my father's men tracked them down, she was already dead. The flat, emotionless delivery of such a horrific story somehow made it more devastating than if he had displayed obvious grief. Gabriella felt her throat tighten with unwanted sympathy for the 12-year-old boy who had lost his mother to Mafia violence.
I'm sorry, she said softly.
I can't imagine what that must have been like. Rocco's gaze snapped back to her, assessing whether her sympathy was genuine or strategic. Whatever he saw in her expression must have satisfied him because he nodded slightly. It taught me that in my world, everyone you love is a potential target. That caring about someone makes you vulnerable in ways that can be exploited by enemies. My father became harder after that. To never let emotion cloud judgment, to protect what's mine with absolute force. And is that what I am? Gabriella asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Something you're protecting. You're something I'm responsible for, Rocco corrected, but there was a subtle distinction in his tone that she couldn't quite pass. Which means ensuring your safety while you're under my roof, regardless of the circumstances that brought you here. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the library door, and one of Rocco's men entered with a message that required his immediate attention. He stood with visible reluctance, gathering his papers and reading glasses, and paused before leaving. You're welcome to use the library whenever you wish, he said. And if you need anything, books, art supplies, whatever might make your stay more bearable, tell Teresa and she'll arrange it. After he left, Gabriella sat in the window seat for a long time, her book forgotten in her lap as she tried to reconcile the complex man she had just talked with against the violent criminal who had orchestrated her kidnapping. The cognitive dissonance was unsettling, making it harder to maintain the clear lines of victim and captor that should have defined their relationship. The next week fell into an unexpected rhythm. Gabriella spent her days reading in the library, exploring the extensive gardens under watchful supervision, and occasionally encountering Rocco in various parts of the estate. Their interactions were careful, both of them navigating the strange territory of captor and captive who were gradually, almost unwillingly, becoming something more like acquaintances. He never restricted her access to any part of the house except his private office and certain basement areas that she suspected housed less savory aspects of his business operations. She never attempted to escape, partly because the security made it pointless, but also because a treacherous part of her had begun to feel almost safe here. That realization disturbed her more than she wanted to admit. Stockholm Syndrome, she told herself firmly, was a psychological phenomenon she needed to guard against. But it was difficult to maintain proper fear and hatred of a man who remembered that she took her coffee with 2 sugars, who left books he thought she'd enjoy on the library table with little notes about why he'd selected them, who asked thoughtful questions about her architectural opinions during their chance encounters. On the 10th day of her captivity, Gabriella met Rocco DeLuca, Rocco's younger sister, and everything became even more complicated. Alessia arrived at the estate like a whirlwind of energy and designer clothing, sweeping through the front doors with shopping bags and laughter that echoed through the usually quiet halls. She was 24, stunningly beautiful with the same dark hair as her brother, but warmer brown eyes, and she possessed an effervescent personality that seemed completely at odds with the dangerous family she belonged to. When Teresa brought her to the library where Gabriella was reading her usual refuge, Alessia's eyes lit up with genuine curiosity rather than the wariness or pity Gabriella had expected. "So you're the mysterious guest my brother has been so secretive about," Alessia said, dropping her shopping bags and settling onto the couch across from Gabriella with the comfort of someone completely at home. "I'm Alessia, and before you ask, yes, I know you didn't exactly choose to be here, and yes, I think the whole situation is problematic at best, but I also know my brother, and if he's keeping you here, there's a reason beyond just business." The directness was refreshing after days of careful politeness from household staff, and despite her better judgment, Gabriella found herself responding to Alessia's warm energy. "Gabriella Marino, and your brother kidnapped me from my wedding, so forgive me if I'm not particularly interested in his reasons." "Wedding to Marco Bianchi," Alessia said, wrinkling her nose in distaste. "Trust me, whatever Rocco's motivations, he did you a favor on that front. Marco is a snake who treats women like property. You would have been miserable. As opposed to being a prisoner here?" Gabriella countered, but there was less heat in her words than she'd intended. Alessia studied her with shrewd intelligence that reminded Gabriella forcibly of Rocco. "But you don't really feel like a prisoner anymore, do you? Teresa says you've been exploring the estate freely, using the library daily, even having conversations with my brother that last longer than strictly necessary. That doesn't sound like a typical hostage situation." The perceptiveness of the observation made Gabriella uncomfortable because it was accurate. "I'm making the best of a terrible situation. That doesn't mean I've forgotten what this is." "Fair enough," Alessia said, then brightened. "But since you're here anyway, would you like company? I spend a lot of time at the estate because my apartment in Milan feels lonely, and I've been dying for another woman to talk to. The men around here are terrible conversationalists unless you want to discuss business or weapons." And just like that, Gabriella found herself with an unlikely friend. Over the following days, Alessia became a regular presence, arriving with gifts, books, art supplies, beautiful clothes and genuine interest in getting to know Gabriella beyond her status as her brother's captive. They talked about everything from fashion to philosophy, from favorite films to family dynamics, and Alessia shared stories about growing up in the DeLuca household that painted a more nuanced picture of Rocco than Gabriella had been prepared for. "He's been different since you arrived," Alessia mentioned one afternoon as they sat in the gardens. Watercolor supplies spread between them as Alessia attempted to teach Gabriella to paint. "More present, somehow. He usually buries himself in work, maintaining emotional distance from everything except his responsibilities to the family. But I've caught him actually smiling a few times recently, which is practically a miracle." Gabriella's hand stilled over her painting. "That has nothing to do with me. He probably just concluded a successful business deal or something." "Keep telling yourself that," Alessia said with a knowing smile. "But I've known my brother for 24 years, and I've never seen him bring a woman to the estate, let alone spend time actually talking to one beyond superficial pleasantries. You're affecting him whether you realize it or not." The implication made Gabriella deeply uncomfortable because it suggested a connection that went beyond captor and captive, and acknowledging that connection felt like betraying herself. "Your brother kidnapped me, Alessia. Whatever else might be happening, that fundamental fact doesn't change." "No, it doesn't," Alessia agreed, setting down her paintbrush and turning serious. "And I'm not asking you to forget that or forgive it. I'm just saying that nothing in this family is simple. And Rocco carrying the weight of our father's expectations while trying to maintain some shred of humanity in an inhuman business is more complicated than you might think. He's not the monster you want him to be, Gabriella. But he's also not a hero. He's just a man trying to survive in the world he was born into." That evening, Gabriella found herself drawn to the estate's chapel, a small stone building set apart from the main house that Teresa had mentioned during her initial tour, but that Gabriella hadn't yet explored. The interior was simple but beautiful, with plain wooden pews, candles flickering in holders along the walls, and a single stained glass window that cast colored light across the stone floor when the sun hit it at the right angle. It felt peaceful in a way that the rest of the estate didn't, as if violence and criminal dealings couldn't penetrate these sacred walls. She wasn't particularly religious, her father had been, in the casual way of cultural Catholics who attended Mass on holidays and baptized their children, but something about the space called to her. She was sitting in one of the pews, simply existing in the quiet, when the door opened and Rocco entered. He stopped when he saw her, clearly surprised to find someone in the chapel, and for a moment Gabriella thought he would leave. Instead, he moved down the aisle and sat in the pew directly across from hers, separated by the narrow aisle but close enough that she could see the exhaustion lining his face. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, the silence punctuated only by the soft whisper of wind through cracks in the old stone and the gentle guttering of candle flames. Then Gabriella noticed what Rocco held in his hands, a photograph, old and worn at the edges, of a beautiful woman with dark hair and Rocco's grey eyes. His mother, she realized, recognizing the resemblance and remembering his story about her death. "I come here sometimes," Rocco said quietly, not looking at Gabriella but addressing the space between them. "When the weight of everything becomes too heavy. I'm not sure I believe any more in God, in divine justice, in any of it, but this place feels like the only spot on the estate where I can let my guard down." Gabriella watched him stare at the photograph, his thumb tracing the edges with the careful reverence of someone handling something precious and fragile. "What was she like, your mother?" "Kind," Rocco said immediately, which seems like such an inadequate word, but it's the truest one I have. She was kind in a world that punished kindness, gentle in a family that valued strength above all else, and she tried desperately to teach me and Alessia that there were other ways to live beyond violence and fear. He finally looked up, his grey eyes meeting Gabriella's with raw vulnerability that stole her breath. "She would have hated what I've become, what my father made me into after she died. Or maybe she would have understood that you did what you had to in order to survive," Gabriella heard herself say, and meant it. "That you're still trying to hold on to pieces of who you were even while fulfilling obligations you never asked for." Something shifted in Rocco's expression, a crack in the armor he wore so consistently, and he stood from his pew and crossed the aisle to sit beside her. Not touching, careful to maintain respectful distance, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body and smell the subtle cologne he wore. They sat like that as darkness fell outside and the chapel grew dim except for candlelight, two people carrying wounds they hadn't chosen, finding unexpected comfort in shared silence. "I'm sorry," Rocco said eventually, "for taking you, for putting you in this position. You're right that you're not responsible for your father's crimes, and using you as leverage was, I won't say wrong because in my world it was strategically sound. But it was unfair, and you deserved better." The apology, unexpected and apparently genuine, threatened to undo something in Gabriella's careful emotional defenses. "Why tell me this now? Because I keep trying to maintain the fiction that you're simply a prisoner and this is simply business," Rocco said, his voice rough with emotion he usually kept hidden. "But the truth is, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since I carried you out of that wedding. Not as an asset or a hostage, but as a person who deserves better than being traded between men who see her as a commodity." Before Gabriella could process what she was hearing, what it might mean, an explosion shattered the evening stillness. The chapel's windows blew inward in a shower of colored glass, and Rocco's body covered hers instantly, pressing her down against the wooden pew as debris rained around them. Shouts erupted from the grounds, followed by the unmistakable sound of gunfire, not blanks this time, but real weapons with deadly intent. The estate was under attack. Rocco pulled Gabriella to her feet with urgent efficiency, his hand gripping hers as he led her away from the chapel through a side door she hadn't noticed. "Stay low, stay close, and do exactly what I say," he commanded, all traces of vulnerability replaced by the cold operational focus of someone trained for combat. They ran through the gardens as more explosions rocked the grounds, smoke rising from what looked like the garages and guest houses. Rocco spoke rapidly into a phone he'd produced from his pocket, issuing orders in clipped Italian to his security forces as he pulled Gabriella toward the main house. Gunfire erupted closer, and Rocco pushed her behind a fountain, drawing a weapon from the holster at his back that she hadn't realized he was carrying.
"Who's attacking?"
Gabriella gasped, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "Marco Bianchi," Rocco said grimly, leaning around the fountain to assess the situation. "Your erstwhile fiancé has decided to retrieve his stolen bride and eliminate the competition in one move. Very efficient of him." More men in tactical gear appeared, but these wore the DeLuca colors, falling into defensive positions around Rocco and Gabriella with the practiced coordination of a well-trained private army. Rocco issued orders, and they began moving toward the main house in formation. Gabriella kept in the center of their protective square as bullets whined through the air and struck marble statuary with sharp cracks. They were almost to the house when a figure emerged from the smoke, weapon raised and aimed directly at Gabriella. Time seemed to slow as she registered Marco Bianchi's face, twisted with rage and determination, his finger tightening on the trigger. Rocco's body was already moving, pivoting to place himself between Gabriella and the gun. But before either action could complete, one of Rocco's men took the shot. Marco went down clutching his shoulder, his weapon clattering to the ground. Rocco's men converged on the fallen attacker, securing him with brutal efficiency, while the rest of the security forces worked to repel the remaining assault. Rocco turned to Gabriella, his hands moving over her with urgent care, checking for injuries. "Are you hurt? Did anything hit you?" "I'm fine," Gabriella managed, though she was shaking so violently she could barely stand. "But you stepped in front of me. You could have been shot." "Yes," Rocco said simply, as if this were obvious. "That's what protection means." The fighting lasted another 20 minutes before Marco's forces retreated, leaving behind casualties and the smoldering remains of several outbuildings. Rocco's men had taken prisoners, including Marco himself, who was being dragged toward the main house with blood streaming from his shoulder wound. Throughout it all, Rocco kept Gabriella close, only releasing her when they reached a secure room deep in the Esteta-reinforced space that served as a panic room, where Alessia was already waiting, looking terrified but unharmed. Alessia rushed to embrace her brother, then pulled Gabriella into the hug as well, the three of them standing together in the aftermath of violence while chaos continued outside. "I was so scared," Alessia whispered. "When the explosion started, I thought we're safe," Rocco assured her, though his eyes remained locked on Gabriella. "Everyone's safe." But as the adrenaline of the attack began to fade, Gabriella found herself trembling not from fear but from the realization that had crystallized during those terrifying minutes. When she had seen Marco's gun aimed at her, her first thought hadn't been about escape or rescue. It had been concern for Rocco's safety, terror at the thought of him being hurt protecting her. Somewhere in the past 2 weeks, without conscious decision, her feelings toward her captor had transformed into something far more complicated and dangerous than simple fear or even Stockholm Syndrome. She had begun to care about Rocco DeLuca. And judging by the way he was still watching her with that fierce protective intensity, as if he couldn't quite believe she was unharmed, he had begun to care about her too. In the dim light of the panic room, as Alessia fussed over both of them and security reports continued to filter in through Rocco's phone, Gabriella and Rocco's eyes met across the small space. No words were spoken, but understanding passed between them, nonetheless a recognition that whatever had been building between them over stolen conversations and shared vulnerabilities had just been sealed by violence and near death. They had crossed some invisible line from which there could be no return. When the all-clear finally came and it was safe to emerge, Rocco helped both women out of the panic room and back toward the main house. As they walked through halls where the smell of smoke still lingered and windows were shattered from the attack, Rocco's hand found Gabriella's and held it firmly. She didn't pull away. Instead, she laced her fingers through his, accepting the comfort and the connection even as her rational mind screamed warnings about the danger of caring for this man. At her bedroom door, Rocco paused. "I'm posting guards directly outside tonight. After what happened, I can't take any chances with your safety." "Rocco," Gabriella said, his name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. "Thank you for protecting me. You didn't have to." "I did," he interrupted, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with surprising gentleness. "I did have to. because somewhere in the past 2 weeks this stopped being about your father's debt or strategic leverage. You've become—" He trailed off, seeming to struggle with words, before finally settling on, "important. You've become important." Then, before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his shoulders straight and his stride purposeful, every inch the dangerous Mafia prince who had orchestrated her kidnapping. But Gabriella stood in her doorway long after he disappeared, her fingers pressed to the cheek he had touched, and acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She didn't want to leave anymore, and that should have terrified her more than any kidnapping or attack ever could. The aftermath of Rocco Bianchi's attack transformed the estate from Gabriella's gilded cage into something closer to an armed fortress, with security doubled and new protocols implemented that restricted movement even for long-time household staff. But the increased restrictions somehow bothered Gabriella less than they should have, perhaps because the violence had clarified something essential about her situation. She was safer within these walls, with Rocco's protection, than she would be anywhere else in a world where powerful men viewed her as a chess piece to be captured or eliminated according to their strategic interests. In the 3 days following the attack, Gabriella saw little of Rocco beyond brief glimpses as he coordinated with his security forces and managed the fallout from Rocco's assault. She learned from Alessia, who continued to be a steady presence despite her own fear, that Rocco Bianchi had survived his gunshot wound and was being held in a secure location, while Rocco decided how to handle the situation. The Bianchi family had formally disavowed Rocco's unauthorized attack, claiming he had acted alone out of personal obsession rather than family sanction, which everyone knew was political maneuvering to avoid a full-scale war with the DeLucas. "My brother could demand Rocco's life as restitution," Alessia explained one afternoon as they attempted to restore order to the library, where several shelves had collapsed during the explosions. "Family law would support that claim, but I think he's hesitating because of you." Gabriella looked up from the books she was sorting, confusion evident in her expression. "What does Rocco's fate have to do with me?" "Everything," Alessia said with the bluntness that had become familiar. "Rocco attacked this estate specifically to retrieve you and eliminate Rocco. If Rocco executes him now, he's essentially declaring that you're valuable enough to warrant that level of response. It's a statement about possession and protection. That goes beyond you being simple leverage for your father's debt. The entire family network will interpret it as Rocco claiming you as his." The casual mention of being claimed should have sparked outrage, but instead Gabriella felt something more complicated, a flutter of fear mixed with anticipation mixed with curiosity about what such a claim might actually mean. "And what if I have opinions about being claimed by anyone? Then you should probably talk to my brother," Alessia suggested gently, "because avoiding each other after what happened in the chapel and during the attack is just making everything more confused." That evening, Gabriella took Alessia's advice and went looking for Rocco with determined purpose. She found him exactly where she somehow knew she would in the chapel, which had been hastily repaired after the attack, sitting in the same pew where he had shared his vulnerability days before. The photograph of his mother rested in his hands again, and in the candlelight he looked exhausted and somehow younger, as if the weight he constantly carried had briefly overwhelmed his defenses. She approached quietly and sat beside him without asking permission, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a long moment neither spoke, falling into the comfortable silence that had characterized their previous encounter in this space. Finally, Rocco set the photograph carefully on the pew between them and turned to face her. "I've been avoiding you," he said bluntly. "Which is cowardly, but I wasn't sure what to say after everything." "You saved my life," Gabriella replied. "Several times, actually, if you count the explosions and the gunfire. That seems like something worth acknowledging." "I put your life in danger by bringing you here in the first place," Rocco countered, and there was genuine anguish in his voice that struck something deep in Gabriella's chest. "Rocco would never have targeted you if you weren't associated with me. Your father's crimes are nothing compared to the danger I've exposed you to." Gabriella considered this, turning it over in her mind along with all the revelations and realizations of the past 2 weeks. "My father was marrying me off to Rocco anyway," she said slowly. "So I would have been in danger regardless, just in a different form. At least here, with you, I have some agency, some choice in what happens next." "Do you?" Rocco asked, and the question held such hope and fear that it made Gabriella's breath catch. Have choice, I mean. Because I can give you that, Gabriella. Your father finally made contact yesterday through intermediaries. He can't pay the full debt, but he's offering information on Marco's operations and his own business dealings in exchange for your release. I could let you go, tonight, if you wanted. Alessia could take you anywhere in the world, set you up with a new identity, money, everything you'd need to start over. The offer hung between them, genuine and terrifying in its implications. Gabriella searched Rocco's face and saw the truth there. He meant it. He would actually release her, sacrifice his leverage and his strategic advantage, if that's what she wanted. The realization that her captor was offering her freedom without conditions or strings attached should have been the answer to every prayer she'd sent up over the past 2 weeks. So why did the thought of leaving make her feel like she was being torn apart? What do you want? Gabriella asked, instead of answering, needing to understand his perspective before she could clarify her own confused feelings. Rocco's hand came up to cradle her face with the same gentle reverence he had shown the photograph of his mother. I want you to stay, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Not as a prisoner or leverage, but as someone who chooses to be here. Who chooses me, despite everything I am and everything I've done. But that's not fair to ask, is it? Because I took your choice away when I kidnapped you, and anything you feel now might just be a survival mechanism rather than genuine. Do you think I'm so weak that I can't distinguish between survival and genuine feeling? Gabriella challenged, surprising herself with the heat in her voice. I've spent 2 weeks in this house, Rocco.
2 weeks of watching how you treat your staff with respect, how you're trying to build legitimate businesses alongside the criminal empire your father left.
How you support orphanages and schools in the communities your family controls. I've seen you with your sister, gentle and protective in ways that contradict everything you show the world. I've talked with you about architecture and philosophy and loss. That's not Stockholm Syndrome, that's me actually getting to know you. And what have you concluded from this knowledge? Rocco asked, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with such tenderness that she felt tears prick her eyes. That you're the most complicated, frustrating, dangerous man I've ever met, Gabriella said honestly. That you terrify me and fascinate me in equal measure. That I should hate you for what you did, and part of me does, but a bigger part is starting to... She hesitated, afraid to name what she was feeling. Starting to what? Rocco pressed, leaning closer until their foreheads almost touched. Care, Gabriella whispered. I'm starting to care about you in ways that make no logical sense and that I can't seem to control or rationalize away. The admission seemed to break something loose in Rocco, and he pulled her into his arms with sudden fierce need, holding her against his chest as if she was something precious he couldn't bear to lose. Gabriella wrapped her arms around him in return, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the rapid beating of his heart that matched her own elevated pulse. They sat like that for long minutes, just holding each other in the candlelit chapel, and it felt more intimate than any kiss could have been, a meeting of souls rather than just bodies. I don't know how to do this, Rocco admitted into her hair. I've never cared about anyone outside of Alessia, never let anyone close enough to matter. You've destroyed every defense I've spent years building, and I don't know what to do with these feelings. Then we'll figure it out together, Gabriella said, pulling back enough to meet his eyes. But I need you to understand I'm not asking for easy. I'm not naive enough to think that caring about you means everything becomes simple. Your world is violent and dangerous, and if I stay, I'm choosing to navigate that reality alongside you. If you stay, Rocco repeated, and there was such naked vulnerability in those 3 words that Gabriella felt her last defenses crumble completely. When I stay, she corrected, and watched something like joy transform his features before he leaned in and pressed his lips to her forehead in a gesture so tender it made her chest ache. The days that followed that conversation in the chapel brought subtle but significant changes to the estate and to Gabriella's role within it. She was no longer treated as a prisoner under guard, but as Rocco's guest and, potentially something more, though they were both careful not to define exactly what more meant yet. Rocco began including her in aspects of his daily routine, asking her opinions on business decisions that had nothing to do with crime and everything to do with the legitimate enterprises he was attempting to build alongside his family's traditional operations. Teresa noticed the shift immediately, her knowing smile when she served them breakfast together speaking volumes about what the household staff had already surmised. Alessia was less subtle, declaring herself personally responsible for ensuring her brother didn't sabotage this chance at happiness through emotional incompetence or excessive caution. She began planning excursions, carefully secured and heavily guarded excursions, but outings nonetheless to give Gabriella experiences beyond the estate's walls. It was during one such excursion, a visit to a small mountain village where the DeLuca family had funded a new community center, that Gabriella began to truly understand the complexity of Rocco's position. The villagers greeted him with genuine warmth and respect, children running up to show him schoolwork and adults thanking him for opportunities that had transformed their lives. This wasn't the fear-based deference she had expected people to show a mafia boss, but something closer to the relationship between a benevolent lord and his subjects, complicated, certainly, but not purely exploitative. "This is what I want to build," Rocco explained as they toured the community center, a beautiful modern structure that somehow complemented rather than clashed with the historic village architecture. Not replacing the family business. I'm not naive enough to think that's possible, but creating alternatives. Giving people in our territories chances they wouldn't otherwise have. My father thought power came only through fear, but I believe it can also come through providing what the government fails to deliver. Gabriella studied the building with her trained eye, noting the thoughtful design that maximized natural light and created flexible spaces for multiple uses. "This is good architecture," she said with professional appreciation. "Who designed it?" "A firm in Rome," Rocco said. But they struggled with understanding what the community actually needed versus what looked impressive on paper. "I've been thinking—" He paused, seeming uncertain, which was unusual enough that Gabriella gave him her full attention. "I've been thinking that maybe you could consult on the next project. Use your training to help design spaces that actually serve these communities effectively." The offer took her breath away because it represented something she had thought lost forever: the chance to practice her passion, to use her education for meaningful purpose. "You're asking me to work with you? To be part of this?" "I'm asking if you want to make your mark on something real," Rocco said. "To design buildings that will stand for generations and serve people who desperately need them. Unless you'd rather." She kissed him. It wasn't planned or calculated, just an overwhelming surge of emotion that demanded expression. She stepped close and pressed her lips to his, cutting off his words and his uncertainties with the physical acknowledgement of everything that had been building between them since that first meeting in his study. Rocco froze for a heartbeat, clearly startled, then his arms came around her and he kissed her back with gentle reverence, as if she were something infinitely precious that he couldn't quite believe he was allowed to hold. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, villagers who had been discreetly maintaining distance were smiling and politely looking away. Alessia, who had been exploring the facility with her security detail, appeared at Rocco's elbow with a smug expression. "About time," she declared. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in a room together." That evening, back at the estate, Rocco and Gabriella found themselves on the rooftop terrace that overlooked the grounds, the same terrace where Rocco sometimes went to think, away from the weight of family responsibilities. Music drifted up from somewhere in the house, something classical and beautiful, and without discussion, they began to move together in something that might generously be called dancing. It was clumsy and unpracticed, neither of them particularly skilled at this form of expression, but it was theirs, a moment stolen from the complicated reality of their circumstances. "I love you," Rocco said into her hair as they swayed together under the stars. "I know I have no right to say that after everything, but it's true. I love you in ways I didn't know I was capable of loving." Gabriella pulled back enough to see his face, to verify that he meant the words with all the sincerity she heard in his voice. What she saw there, or honesty without masks or defenses, gave her the courage to speak her own truth. "I love you too, which is absolutely insane given that you kidnapped me, but here we are." Rocco's smile was radiant, transforming his usually serious features into something that took her breath away. "Here we are," he agreed, and kissed her again under the vast expanse of night sky. But reality intruded on their happiness 3 days later when Rocco's father, Lorenzo DeLuca, returned from business in Sicily and demanded a family meeting to address the situation with Gabriella. Lorenzo was in his early 60s but looked older, worn down by decades of violence and the constant stress of maintaining criminal empire. He had the same grey eyes as his son, but none of Rocco's carefully controlled warmth, only cold calculation and ruthless pragmatism. Gabriella wasn't invited to the meeting, but Alessia kept her informed through urgent text messages that grew increasingly alarming as the confrontation progressed. Lorenzo was furious that Rocco was wasting leverage by treating Gabriella as a guest rather than a prisoner, and he demanded that Gabriella be used more aggressively to extract information from her father. When Rocco refused, Lorenzo had apparently declared that Rocco was allowing personal feelings to compromise family interests, and that such weakness could not be tolerated in a future Don. The confrontation came to a head when Lorenzo demanded that Rocco prove his commitment to the family by personally overseeing Antonio Marino's executioner death sentence that had been pronounced based on the information Antonio had provided about his own criminal dealings in his desperate attempt to save his daughter. Lorenzo had apparently decided to use this as a test of Rocco's priorities: family duty or personal feeling. Rocco appeared at Gabriella's door 2 hours after the meeting ended, and one look at his face told her everything she needed to know about how it had gone. She pulled him inside without words and held him as he explained the impossible choice his father was forcing upon him: execute the man she loved's father, or lose all credibility as future head of the family. "I can't do it," Rocco said, his voice hollow with despair. "I can't kill your father, Gabriella, not after everything, not knowing what it would do to you. But if I refuse, my father will see it as weakness. And weakness in our world is death. He'll remove me from succession, possibly eliminate me as a threat, and then you'll be at the mercy of whoever he chooses to replace me." Gabriella's mind raced through possibilities and implications, her architect's brain applying systematic analysis to an emotional problem. "What if my father wasn't executed?" she said slowly, an idea forming. "What if instead he was exiled, sent somewhere he could never return, his assets seized, his reputation destroyed, but his life spared?" "My father would never accept that," Rocco said, but she could hear the hope beginning to creep into his voice. "He believes that betrayal must be answered with death, or else others will see it as weakness they can exploit." "Then we need to make exile seem worse than death," Gabriella said, her mind working faster now. "Destroy my father's identity so completely that he becomes a cautionary tale rather than a martyr. Seize everything he owns, expose every crime he committed, make his name synonymous with cowardice and betrayal. Let him live. But make that life so miserable that death would have been mercy. That's not weakness, that's creative punishment that serves as an even more effective deterrent." Rocco stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, admiration and something like awe dawning in his expression. "You're suggesting we make him an example through humiliation rather than execution. That's actually brilliant. Cold as hell, but brilliant." "He used me as a commodity," Gabriella said, and there was steel in her voice now, hardened by weeks of processing her father's ultimate betrayal. "Tried to sell me to Marco Bianchi to save himself. I love him because he's my father, but I'm under no illusions about what he is. He deserves punishment, Rocco. Just not death." The exile solution was presented to Lorenzo DeLuca the next day, and after considerable argument, he agreed to it on the condition that the punishment be carried out with maximum public visibility. Antonio Marino was stripped of everything: his restaurants, his properties, his bank accounts, even his Italian citizenship through carefully pulled strings in immigration bureaucracy. He was sent to a remote region of South America with only enough money to survive in modest discomfort, his reputation destroyed through carefully leaked information about his crimes and cowardice. It was brutal and comprehensive, but it was not death. When Gabriella learned that her father was safely in exile, she felt a complicated mixture of relief and grief. She would likely never see him again, and their relationship, already fractured by his betrayals, was permanently severed. But he was alive, and somehow that mattered enough to balance the scales of her conscience. The situation with Marco Bianchi resolved more violently. The Bianchi family, desperate to avoid war with the DeLucas, delivered Marco to Rocco's justice with apologetic messages about not being able to control their wayward son. Marco was executed by Rocco's men in a formal ceremony that Gabriella was glad not to witness, and his death closed the final chapter on the original circumstances that had brought her to the estate. 6 months later, everything and nothing had changed. Gabriella had officially moved into the estate permanently, her status shifting from prisoner to guest to partner so gradually that pinpointing the exact transformation was impossible. She worked alongside architects on community projects throughout DeLuca territory, her designs bringing beauty and functionality to neighborhoods that had long been neglected by official infrastructure. She and Rocco navigated the complicated dance of a relationship built on unconventional foundations, learning each other's rhythms and boundaries with the patience of people committed to making something impossible somehow work. Alessia declared herself the world's best matchmaker and took credit for everything, despite having done very little beyond facilitating conversations. Teresa beamed with maternal pride whenever she saw Rocco and Gabriella together, clearly thrilled that the young man she had helped raise had found someone who could make him smile. Even Lorenzo had grudgingly accepted Gabriella's presence, particularly after she proved her value by designing a legitimate office complex that significantly enhanced the DeLuca family's respectable business holdings. It was Alessia who first suggested the wedding not an arrangement or a strategic alliance, but an actual celebration of genuine love, freely chosen by both parties. She brought it up over breakfast one morning with her characteristic lack of subtlety, asking when Rocco planned to make things official because she was tired of having to explain their complicated relationship status to relatives. Rocco and Gabriella exchanged glances across the table, that silent communication they had developed over months of learning each other's languages. The idea should have been absurd: a wedding to celebrate a relationship that had begun with kidnapping, to formalize bonds forged in violence and captivity. But somehow it also felt right, a way to reclaim and redefine the wedding day that had been stolen from Gabriella all those months ago. "Would you want that?" Rocco asked Gabriella directly, ignoring Alessia's presence despite her proximity. "A wedding, I mean, or is the whole concept too tainted by what happened before?" Gabriella considered the question seriously, examining her feelings with the honesty their relationship demanded. "I think," she said slowly, "that having a wedding I actually choose, to a man I genuinely love, would be the most powerful way to reclaim what was taken from me. So yes, Rocco DeLuca, I would want that." The wedding was planned for 3 months later, giving them time to organize something intimate but meaningful. Unlike her first wedding, which had been a grand performance designed to impress 200 guests she barely knew, this ceremony would be small: just family, close friends, and the household staff who had become family over the months. They chose the estate's chapel as the venue, the space where so much of their emotional foundation had been built through vulnerable conversations and shared pain. Gabriella designed her own dress this time, working with a dressmaker to create something that reflected who she actually was rather than who her father had wanted her to be. The result was elegant simplicity silk that flowed rather than constraining, delicate lace that suggested rather than overpowered, and a design that allowed her to move freely and breathe deeply. No cathedral train, no suffocating corset, no tiara that made her head ache. Just beauty that felt authentic to her. The day of the wedding arrived with perfect weather, sunny but not hot, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses from the gardens. Gabriella prepared in her suite, Alessia serving as maid of honor and providing running commentary that kept Gabriella laughing through her nerves. When it was time, Teresa appeared to escort her downstairs, tears already streaming down the older woman's face as she looked at Gabriella in her wedding gown. "You look perfect, Signorina," Teresa said, using the formal address despite having long since become more family than employee. "And you're making the right choice. My boy, he loves you with everything he has. He'll protect you, cherish you, until his last breath." Gabriella hugged Teresa carefully, not wanting to wrinkle the dress but needing the physical connection.
"I know," she said softly.
"That's why I'm here." The chapel was small enough that there was no dramatic walk down the aisle, just a few steps from the door to where Rocco waited with the priest. Rocco wore a perfectly tailored suit that somehow made him look even more devastatingly handsome than usual, but it was his expression when he saw her that made Gabriella's breath catch. His grey eyes shone with unshed tears, and the smile that transformed his face was pure joy without the shadows that usually haunted his features. The ceremony itself was traditional, the priest conducting mass and blessing their union with words about love and commitment and the sacred bonds of marriage. But when it came time for their personal vows, both Gabriella and Rocco set aside the formal words they had prepared in favor of something more honest. "I, Rocco Lorenzo DeLuca," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly affecting him, "vow to protect you, cherish you, and honor the choice you made to stay when you could have left. You've given me something I never thought I'd have the possibility of being more than what my family's legacy demanded. You've shown me that strength can coexist with gentleness. That power can be used to build rather than destroy. I promise to spend every day of my life proving worthy of the trust you've placed in me, to give you freedom within safety, voice within protection, and love without conditions or reservations. For all my days, Gabriella, for all my days." Gabriella's vision blurred with tears as she responded with her own vows. "I, Gabriella Sofia Marina," she said, reclaiming the name she was about to change, "vow to stand beside you as your partner and equal. You've shown me what it means to be truly seen not as a commodity or a burden, but as a complete person with agency and value. You've given me space to pursue my passions, protected me from threats I didn't know existed, and loved me despite the impossible circumstances that brought us together. I promise to be your light when darkness threatens to overwhelm, your conscience when duty demands things that conflict with your heart, and your companion through whatever complications our life together brings. I regret nothing that led me here, Rocco. I choose you freely and completely for all our days." When the priest finally declared them married and invited Rocco to kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was gentle and reverent, a promise sealed with physical tenderness rather than passion. The small gathering erupted in applause and cheers, Alessia openly crying while Teresa dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even Lorenzo, sitting stiffly in the front pew, looked something close to pleased, though he maintained his stern expression with determined consistency. The reception was held in the estate's gardens, where tables had been set up under strings of lights that would glow as evening fell. There were toasts Alessia's funny and heartfelt, Lorenzo's brief and formal but not unkind, Teresa's rambling and emotional and dancing, and laughter that felt almost normal despite the complicated realities underlying this union. As twilight deepened and stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Rocco led Gabriella away from the celebration to the rooftop terrace where they had danced once before. Music drifted up from the party below, and they moved together with slightly more grace than their first attempt, months of knowing each other reflected in how naturally they fit together. "Do you regret it?" Rocco asked quietly, the question he had posed once before, but which took on new weight now that their commitment was formalized. "Choosing this life? Choosing me?" Gabriella looked up at this complicated, dangerous, surprisingly gentle man who had somehow become the center of her world. "Every choice I made led me to you," she said, echoing the words from her vows. "The kidnapping, the captivity, even my father's betrayals, all of it brought me to this moment. How could I regret the path that gave me you, even knowing what my world entails?" Rocco pressed, because he needed her to acknowledge the ongoing reality they would navigate together. The violence, the moral ambiguity, the constant security concerns. Even knowing all of that, Gabriella confirmed. "I'm not naive, Rocco. I understand that your position requires difficult decisions and that our life together will never be simple or safe. But I also understand that you're trying to transform your family's legacy, to build something better alongside the darkness you inherited. I want to be part of that transformation. I want to stand beside you and help create the change you're working toward." Rocco pulled her closer, resting his chin on top of her head as they continued their slow dance under the stars. "You've already created more change than you realize," he said softly. "Before you, I was becoming exactly what my father wanted: cold, calculating, willing to sacrifice anything for strategic advantage. You reminded me that there's another way. That power doesn't have to mean abandoning humanity." "You saved me too," Gabriella murmured against his chest. "From a marriage I didn't want, from becoming the person my father tried to shape me into, from a life of quiet resignation. You gave me agency, Rocco. Freedom to choose my own path even when that path led back to you. They stood together on that rooftop, two people who had found each other through the most unlikely and ethically complicated circumstances imaginable, and in that moment, surrounded by the estate that had transformed from prison to home, they both felt something rare and precious: peace. A year later, Gabriella's first major architectural project opened to widespread acclaim, a community center in Naples that provided educational resources, job training, and safe gathering spaces for a neighborhood that had long been neglected. The design was featured in architectural journals, praised for its innovative use of space and its sensitivity to the community's actual needs. Gabriella attended the opening with Rocco beside her, and for the first time, she stood in a building she had created from imagination to reality, watching people use the spaces she had designed exactly as she had envisioned. Your mother would be proud, she told Rocco as they watched children playing in the center's courtyard while their parents attended classes in adjacent rooms. Of this project, of what you're building, of who you're becoming. Rocco's arm tightened around her waist, and your architectural dreams are finally reality. You're leaving your mark on the world, Principessa. Creating beauty and functionality that will serve people for generations. The nickname that had once been mocking had transformed over their time together into an endearment, spoken with affection and respect rather than condescension. Gabriella leaned into him, comfortable with the physical intimacy they had developed gradually, with the deep trust that allowed for vulnerability. That evening, as they returned to the estate, Gabriella made an announcement that would change their lives in yet another fundamental way. I'm pregnant, she said simply, watching Rocco's face carefully for his reaction. For a moment, he simply stared at her, processing the information with visible effort. Then a smile spread across his features, transforming them with joy and wonder and something that looked like fear. We're having a baby? He asked, as if needing confirmation that he had heard correctly. We're having a baby. Gabriella confirmed, and found herself lifted off her feet and spun around as Rocco's careful control dissolved into pure, elated excitement. The pregnancy was celebrated by the entire household, with Teresa immediately beginning to plan for the nursery and Alessia declaring herself the world's best aunt-in-waiting. Even Lorenzo seemed pleased, making rare references to legacy and grandchildren that suggested he viewed this development as securing the DeLuca family's future. For Gabriella and Rocco, it represented something even more significant, the ultimate symbol of their choice to build a life together, to create new possibilities out of the complicated circumstances that had brought them together. 7 months later, on a crisp autumn evening, Gabriella gave birth to a daughter they named Sofia Elena DeLuca, Sofia after her mother, Elena after Rocco's mother. The baby was perfect, with dark hair and eyes that shifted between grey and brown depending on the light, and when Rocco held his daughter for the first time, Gabriella watched tears stream down his face as he made whispered promises to protect her, cherish her, and give her choices he had never been allowed. She'll grow up free, Rocco said, looking up at Gabriella with fierce determination. Free to choose her own path, to pursue her own dreams. We'll protect her from the violence of this world, but we won't trap her in it. She'll have every option we can give her. And as Gabriella watched her husband cradle their daughter with infinite gentleness, she knew that this strange, complicated, beautiful family they had built from the wreckage of kidnapping and forced arrangements was exactly where she was meant to be. 5 years after the abduction that changed everything, Gabriella stood in her architectural studio, a converted building on the estate grounds where she now ran a successful firm specializing in community-focused design and reviewed plans for her latest project. Sophia played nearby with building blocks, already showing her mother's interest in structures and spatial relationships, while Rocco worked at his own desk across the room, managing the legitimate business empire he had carefully built alongside and increasingly instead of his family's criminal operations. They had become something unprecedented in the DeLuca family history, a couple that balanced traditional obligations with progressive change, that acknowledged the darkness of their legacy while actively working to create something better. Lorenzo had finally retired the previous year, officially naming Rocco as Don, and under Rocco's leadership, the family had shifted more resources toward legitimate businesses, reduced their involvement in the most violent aspects of organized crime, and invested heavily in the communities under their protection. It wasn't perfect. They still navigated moral ambiguities and made difficult compromises. There were still enemies and threats, still security concerns that required constant vigilance. But they faced these challenges together, partners in every meaningful sense, and their relationship had only deepened with time and shared experiences. "Mama, look," Sophia called out, having constructed an elaborate tower from her blocks. "I made a building like you." Gabriella moved from her drafting table to admire her daughter's creation, kneeling down to offer architectural feedback with complete seriousness. "That's excellent structural balance," she praised.
"What's it for?"
"Who will use this building?" "For families," Sophia declared with the certainty of a 5-year-old. "So they can be together and be happy." Rocco looked up from his work, meeting Gabriella's eyes across the studio. And in that glance was a lifetime of shared understanding of how they had fought for and built the family happiness his daughter referenced so casually, of how improbable and precious their journey had been, of how grateful they were for every complicated step that had led them here. That evening, after Sophia was asleep and the estate had settled into nighttime quiet, Rocco and Gabriella returned to the rooftop terrace that had become their special space. They stood together looking out over the grounds, Rocco's arms wrapped around Gabriella from behind, her hands resting on his. "I love you," Rocco said, the words as natural as breathing after years of practice. "Today, tomorrow, forever." "You're my greatest choice, Gabriella. My best decision." "And you're mine," Gabriella replied, turning in his arms to face him. "My unexpected rescue, my improbable love, my forever partner. I wouldn't change a single thing about how we found each other." "Not even the kidnapping?" Rocco asked with a slight smile. "Not even that," Gabriella confirmed, completely serious. "Because that impossible beginning led to this beautiful reality. To us, to Sophia, to the life we've built together. Every scar, every challenge, every complicated moment was worth it to get here." They kissed under the stars, in the space they had claimed as theirs, surrounded by the evidence of the life they had chosen and built together. And in that moment, on that rooftop, with their daughter sleeping safely inside and their future stretching before them, they were exactly where they needed to be. Together, freely chosen, forever bound. Thank you for reading Rocco and Gabriella's story. If this tale of unexpected love, second chances, and choosing your own path resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of their journey from captivity to partnership? Which moment touched your heart the most? Clapperboard want more Mafia romance stories? Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss when we release new emotional love stories featuring strong characters, complex relationships, and the power of choice. Speech Balloon, share your thoughts in the comments below. Should I write more stories featuring Alessia's own love story? What other tropes would you like to see explored in future stories? Did the ending satisfy you, or would you like to see an epilogue? Thumbs up if you enjoyed this story. Please like this video. It helps others discover these emotional romance tales. Books, download the complete story by checking the description box for links to the full text version you can read offline. Connect with our community of romance readers who love complex characters, emotional depth, and happily ever afters that feel earned rather than easy. Remember, the best love stories are the ones we choose for ourselves, just like Gabriella chose Rocco, and he chose her in return. What choice will you make today to pursue your own happiness? Thank you for being part of this journey. Until the next story, keep believing in the power of love to transform even the most impossible circumstances into something beautiful.